There is one other thing I do want to mention here, though, which is, again, this idea that fat burning or fat oxidation drives fat loss. And considering what we just described as far as the whole efficient versus inefficient energy production and leaving us with less energy and versus a ton of inflammation and degeneration, I think it's, that goes a long way, but it's not necessarily specific as far as fat loss goes. But some of the more specific things as far as needing fat oxidation for fat loss, for one, I would just say that there's, the research is not necessarily supportive of that. So there's that Kevin Hall study where he was looking at people in the metabolic ward and had them on a low carb diet, high fat diet, versus a higher carb, low fat diet, and found that in the low carb, high fat diet, they had less insulin, they had much higher levels of fatty acid oxidation, meaning they were fat burners, just like they're supposed to be, quote unquote, and yet they had less fat loss. So that just kind of flies right in the face of that idea that we need to be burning fat to lose fat.
Yep. And we've talked about this as well, because when you burn fat, you're also putting brakes on metabolism when you burn excessive amounts of fat. And then you also affect the hormonal systems as far as lipogenesis and redistribution of nutrients or substrate goes. So it's not as simple as, oh, I'm burning fat, so I'm losing fat. It's like, in the process of burning fat, are you also turning down metabolism? Are you also shifting lipogenesis? Are you also adjusting substrate disposition or redistribution? Excuse me. So there's a lot more. Again, it all comes down to what's going on why something is happening. What's the context of it? Not just, oh, uncoupling is good, because it's not always good. Oh, fat burning is good. It's not always good. It really depends on why it's occurring and where it's occurring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to clarify too, yes, in order to get rid of body fat on a literal level, it either needs to be burned or excreted. And just to clarify, that doesn't mean that you need to do things that increase fat burning to have fat burning. As we said earlier, there's always going to be some amount of fat oxidation going on. And as long as you're just getting that baseline level of fat oxidation, but you're decreasing fat deposition, you're going to lose fat. And the biggest thing that dictates fat deposition is hormone related.
Hormone, yep.
Yep. And so when you keep the stress hormones down by having adequate energy and driving thyroid hormone and actually having insulin, which is an important part of making sure that the cells are getting carbohydrates and that the liver is...
Because it's not only anabolic for fat tissue, which I think people need to understand as well. It's not just like insulin equals fat. It's not just insulin drives substrate into fat. It also drives substrate into other cells and tissues as well. So it's important to realize that just because you have insulin doesn't mean you're going to be fat. I mean, bodybuilders are using insulin to build tissue.
Well, it's also important to recognize that fat can be deposited with low insulin. Otherwise, people who were just only burning fat and having then they would be losing a ton of weight immediately, at all times. They would never be able to store any fat. So they would just be nonstop burning whatever's coming from their tissues, which is not the case. You do still have fat deposition when you're not eating carbs and you have low insulin.
Yep.
But yeah, so that's a huge part of it that's worth describing. And again, the other part too. So as long as you're always going to be oxidizing some amount of fat, as long as you're not storing it, you will have fat loss. The other side as well is that fat can also be excreted through the liver. It's a more minor pathway, but it does happen. So that's another way that we would kind of quote unquote get rid of body fat.
Well, also elevating some of the youth hormones or some of the sex hormones like testosterone or progesterone or DHT will upregulate fat oxidation, but in the muscles, and increase muscle mass and things like that, which will be more helpful than just running on the treadmill for an excessive amount or just becoming a pure fat burner.
Right. It's not going to be increasing them to the levels of a low carb diet. Yeah.
No, definitely not. But the other thing you'll see, and the thing that is sort of the kicker here, is that when you see people taking exogenous hormones, you start to see fat deposition, or like, for example, people taking corticosteroids. But then when you start to see people taking androgens, you see the fat loss rapid, and it's fat loss with lean tissue gain at rates that are kind of hard to account for just on a daily basis. You have an adjustment in metabolism overall and an adjustment of how nutrients are used that is just, it changes the system more so than like a calories in, calories out type of idea, or just oh, I just need to burn more fat type of idea. Like there's like a systemic signal on multiple levels to shift pathways into certain directions. And that's where context becomes important. And when you start seeing something like that, it really brings in the question of the idea of, oh, I just need to burn fat. At least for me, when I see, somebody could take a steroid and build lean tissue while shredding ridiculous amounts of fat. It's like, okay, there's something going on here that's just purely beyond this idea of you have X amount of fat molecules that produce X amount of energy, and we're just going to go through that as fast as possible. There's other mechanisms, and it's like, what are those mechanisms, and what's the context surrounding that? What does the androgen change the cells? What response do the cells have to the androgens, or to thyroid hormone, or to glucocorticoids, or etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and there's, again, as we've kind of alluded to, there's a major cost to that kind of low carb version of wanting to burn fat, especially when you're looking at it systemically.
Yeah, when you look at hormones and you see elevations in cortisol, decrease in thyroid hormone function, elevations in adrenaline, decrease in androgens. I mean, you see prominent low carb people coming out and saying, oh, my testosterone is like 300. And that's at the bottom of the reference range. You're just like, well, something's got to be going on there. Or my cholesterol is sky high. My cholesterol is like 300 something, 400 something, whatever it is, high 200s. And they're like, 30 years old. It's like, okay, there's an issue, or TSH is elevated, or T3, T4 are way in the bottom of the reference range. Yeah. That's indicating what's going on a systemic level.
Yeah. Yep. And we've talked about the whole situation with cholesterol. It's not as simple as higher is worse. In the case you're describing, it's just a sign of hypothyroidism, but
exactly. Yeah.
Or low metabolism, same thing.